Do you believe the Bible is absolutely infallible? Do you think the biblical stories reflect real history? By biblical stories, I mean those of the Israelites, and most of all, the notorious story of Moses and Pharaoh. Since they were revered as a long line of fulfilled prophecies, every one of the Israelite stories depended on the next. And if one of them is not true, none of them are. For centuries we have been deceived and brainwashed. For all the Israelite stories, including that of Abraham, Joseph, and Moses, never took place on Egyptian soil. The Israelites were never slaves in Egypt. Rather, we have all along been enslaved by the falsehood of this story. For Egypt knew neither Pharaohs nor Israelites. In this video and throughout a series of upcoming episodes, we are going to touch upon some of the points we bring forth in our best-selling book, Egypt Knew No Pharaohs Nor Israelites. If we want to dig deeper and get to the truth behind the Israelite stories, we should first look at the milieu of those stories. If we analyze the Israelite stories as dramatic works, we will find many themes that characterize them, like tribalism as strongly reflected by the continuous tribal wars, and nomadic style of living that is heavily reflected in shepherding and slave trade, totally un-Egyptian themes. Indeed, one of the most prominent themes we find in the Israelite stories is the theme of slavery. The stories of the Jewish patriarchs of Abraham, Joseph, and Moses are all stories of slaves being bought and sold. The Exodus tale is a tale about slaves, a whole lot of them, who have been toiling in captivity for hundreds of years. The Bible speaks of 400 years of continuous bondage and slavery, and of nearly 600,000 slaves exiting Egypt with Moses. And if we added the children and women who were not included, the estimated number of slaves leaving Egypt will soar up to 2 or 3 million people. Think about that. If you put 3 million people in a tight single line, then we are talking about a 568-mile long line. Yeah, that's ridiculous. It would actually account for half the population of Jews in modern-day Israel. Ironically, when we look at the total population of Egypt in the New Kingdom era, when Moses would have still been floating down the Nile, 3 million is our best estimate for the entire population of Egypt. Maybe 4 maximum. Something sounds terribly wrong here, right? The Israelite slaves would have been telling the Pharaoh what to do if there were 3 million of them. And instead of fleeing the land, they could have easily stayed and conquered ancient Egypt. In our extensive research about slavery in the ancient Near East, we have discovered that slavery, where bound humans were regarded as commodities, good for transactions, ownership, and inheritance, was a common culture in Babylon, Assyria, and the Levant. But most notably, the trade in slaves was all pervasive in ancient Arabia and Yemen. That's why both the Quran and Torah are packed with tons of stories about slaves and its trade. This should come as no surprise, since slavery as a common practice is deeply embedded in the ancient Arabian culture and traditions that produced both Judaism and Islam. As a matter of fact, when it comes to slavery and slave trade, Arabs, including the Israelite tribes, are the world pioneers. They started this ugly business much earlier than the Portuguese and the Spanish. As for ancient Egypt, this will surely come as an amazing surprise. Slavery was not at all a common tradition. Throughout most of its 3,000-year kingdom, slave trade was not practiced in ancient Egypt. Of course, there were few references to household slavery in the royal and princely palaces. But I mean this pervasive culture of trading bound humans as merchandise on public markets was definitely not an Egyptian accepted culture. I am not going to refer to prisoners of war and their slave-like status in captivity in ancient Egypt, for the patriarch Joseph was indeed not one, nor was Moses. Slavery as a public and widespread culture was introduced in Egypt at the very, very late period of the Egyptian kingdom, during the 4th and 3rd century BC, and after the Greek conquest, although it was the Greeks and the Romans who propagated the culture of slavery throughout the land of the Nile Valley, but actually it was the Jews of ancient Arabia who first brought the slave trade into ancient Egypt. Historically speaking, Judaism and slave trade are strongly linked, for they both first appeared in the same land, ancient Arabia and Yemen. But why didn't slave trade prosper in Egypt? I put that question to Professor Mustafa El-Abadi, the renowned historian of Greco-Roman Egypt.
As you stated in your query, slavery was very limited. The use of slave labor was very limited in ancient Egypt because, for the simple reason, it was cheaper to deal with free labor. Very cheap.
As servants?
Yes. Yeah. But that slavery existed. It did in the particularly later period of ancient Egyptian history. With the coming of the Greeks and followed by the Romans, these two communities were so used to slave labor.
Slavery, as mentioned in the Bible, was only rampant in ancient Arabia, and it has even lingered well into the modern days of the 19th century. Till this very day, we will find lingering traces of the slavery culture in the Arabian Peninsula, and especially in Yemen, the homeland of the ancient Israelites, as further explained in our book. Slavery in Egypt is actually one of the biblical archaeologists' biggest disappointments. It's almost common knowledge now among Egyptologists that the pyramids, long thought to have been built by the crack of the whip, were actually built by paid labor. The culture of slave trade in the story of Joseph and Moses is so customary and established as the chicken trade that it's hilariously inconsistent with ancient Egyptian traditions. Egypt knew servants and cheap laborers, as the endless examples we present here from our research in the Cairo Museum. not much was found in the records about slaves in ancient Egypt, except maybe prisoners of war who later turned into household slaves and servants of the royal and uppermost class. Most importantly, Egyptians were not familiar with having a marketplace for slave trade like the neighboring cultures of Arabia and Assyria. If ancient Egypt had no public markets for the trade of slaves, where they were bought and sold, then we have to wonder how on earth Joseph, the Israelite patriarch, was ever introduced and sold in ancient Egypt, as the story goes. If 2 million slaves of the working labor force were to suddenly exit ancient Egypt, that would have immediately led to the abrupt fall of the mighty Egyptian empire. Besides, such occurrence did not show at all in the records. The demise of the Egyptian empire was gradual and over many centuries, and it took foreign invasion and conquest by the Persians and later on the Greeks and the Romans to actually bring the Egyptian kingdom to its final eclipse. By now, we should know better than to believe that ancient Egypt was destroyed by the so-called 10 plagues, and that the ancient Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. However, let's hear what Professor Abadi, a leading authority on ancient Egyptian history, has to say about the historicity of the story of the Exodus.
Yes, I doubt very much if such stories really literally took place.
And your reasons, sir?
And
your reasons for that doubt?
first of all, because they are not reported in all Egyptian records. And the Egyptians were very careful about that history. So if they are not recorded in Egyptian records, I look with suspicion on these stories. We know that the ancients were fond of legend and myths. And this is familiar, to say the least.
Yeah. Egypt's king and army were not defeated by Moses and his followers of slaves. As a matter of fact, ancient Egypt hardly practiced slavery. Even more, and to put it bluntly, the Exodus did not take place in Egypt. For simply, Egypt knew no Pharaohs nor any Israelites.